Pray for the preacher this morning. I've got a subject that I want to bring out, and I'm going to tell you. Put that up there, Phil, could you? The casualties of COVID in a small church. That's us. You realize that? This is something that I think that maybe we need to talk about, roll over in our minds, consider, and think about this morning, because I believe that during this COVID, and I really pray to God, I think that we're coming out of this thing. I really feel that way in my heart. But boy, has it been a long, long, hard drive during the COVID. And during that time, how many times have I wondered why that we, remember one time here, I remember Jennifer even had us put up she had little pictures put up of us where Seth and I had pictures to preach to instead of empty pews. Because the COVID had taken from us in our church. One of the things that had crossed my mind many, many times was, as we weren't able to gather together during that time of COVID, what kind of damage is that doing to us as a church? Or is it? Is there any damage that the COVID is doing to us as a small church because that we can't get together? Remember, God put us together as a family. We may not be blood relatives as far as mine and your ancestry goes in this life, but we are blood relatives in the family of God because of our trust in Jesus Christ. That is one of the things we need to realize. But what I want us to look at this morning is something that was brought to my attention. I try to, on Monday mornings, to go to our Southern Baptist ministers get-together. And I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, the director of missions, he had this little paperback book. It looks like one of them little Bantam books. You know what I'm talking about? The small ones. And he was using part of that book to talk to us. And boy, did it hit home. And as he was talking out of that, he had extra copies. You know me, thrifty as I am. He said, anybody that wants a copy of one of them books, he said, you can get it on the way out. Well, I got me one. Books are no good if you don't read them. I didn't get that thing to put up on some shelf to gather dust. I brought it home. People, I read every word in that little book. And oh, did it hit home. You know what it was talking about? The casualties of COVID in churches, just like this one, Buckner Baptist, this morning. Now, when he began to talk about that, I thought, man, that's something that we need to realize and be concerned about. Now, let me get something straight here this morning, right off the top. There are physical casualties that take place. And we've lost some very precious people, not only in this church. Some of you have lost part of your family. Physically, they've died and gone on to be with the Lord. That is a casualty, but is that the only kind of casualty that this COVID has dealt as it's been about in our land? If you'd asked me 5 years ago, could anything shut down this nation the way that COVID has, I would have said there is no way possible that any of that could happen. You know what, Darrell? It did. It shut us down. And as it shut us down, and you know, we have that list, they put it up almost daily. How many people are still in the hospital due to COVID? How many more people have got it this day by day? How many people have died from it? And there's over 11,000 people in Arkansas that have physically died. They are truly physical casualties. We certainly don't want to take from that. Because some of them are very special. They're your friends, your family, your loved ones. But I want to look in this morning and see, are there any casualties that takes place in a church just like this one? I'd no more begin to read in that book of what that he had to say. I want to make sure I've got so many pages, I probably ain't got room to put them up here on this pulpit this morning. There was all kinds of things that stood out to me. I no more than begin to read in that book, and the writer of that book says this: 1/3 of churchgoers, that's not talking about people that just come at Easter and at Christmas, but it's talking about people that come to church on a regular basis. 1/3, this writer said, will never come back to church. Is that a casualty? Yes, it's a casualty. And when we look at that, and when it's talking about that 1/3 of the churchgoers will never come back to church, I think we could look around and see that we're certainly not as big as we was before COVID hit. We were having problems needing a new leader in this church, which we're still praying toward. But we've lost a great amount of people that come on a regular basis here. Now, let me give you some facts. Say, well, is that guy right? How could he be right? Well, let me tell you what I keep hearing. Us preachers have got big ears sometimes. I know preachers from other denominations that I'm very acquainted with. One of them is my brother. And when I began to tell him about how that we were so much fewer in people than we was, he said, Gary, that's not just a problem in your church. He said, in our group of churches, he said, some of them have closed the doors. They've closed the doors because of the casualties of the COVID. And not just his, but I keep talking to other churches. A book would have not been written, and by the way, that book was written in 2021, so it's very up to date. It was written because there was a need, there was a cause there. And the cause is because 1/3 of the people that were regular church-going people are not here, and they're not in other churches. Last Sunday night, we had a young man come into our church here. Never seen him before. Got acquainted with him. I'd say he's got a Christian background from what I could pick up. I just had to ask the question. I said, how did you find out about us as a church? You know what he said? He said, you'd be surprised how many churches in Northwest Arkansas even have a Sunday night service. Let's add to that. You would be surprised how many churches, especially the size of ours, does not even have a Wednesday night Bible study anymore. How are we going to know what God says and what God wants out of our life if we don't study the Word of God? You're not going to. There is a need for Sunday night service. There's a need for Wednesday night service. There's a need for the people that are not here this morning to be here. In that book. Oh, Gary, don't get ugly this morning. I'll try not, okay? If I do, you pray for me. This writer was saying, he said, some of them, part of that 1/3 that's not here, are in other churches. He said they were already making up their minds. He said they had 1 foot out the door already. He said they were just looking for an excuse not to go. I don't know if you'll amen that or agree with it, but I believe there's some truth to that. And so you get down to the question is this. Why do people even come to church? Why do people even need to be part of a church family? And you'll find that that reason has a big difference of why some people are not dedicated to the things of God, their local church, not just Buckner, but other churches as well. Why is it that they don't see the importance of coming to church? It's in the way they're looking at the church. Now, if you ask straight across. The kids, the young adults, the older adults, what they think church is, you would be surprised how many things come around. Now, if you're a little one, I've got great grandkids, some like that, some up. Boy, listen, you see right down through here, it makes a great runway for kids. They love to run up and down through the church, and you hear Mama saying, "Don't do that. We're in God's house." But for a kid, what he sees in the church is a good place to play. I hope that's not adults that feel that way. Sometimes, Daryl, when we talk about church, all that some people see is it's just a building with four walls and a roof over it. Well, in a sense, it is a building. This is a church building. This building is here for where that we, by the way, and God's given us a nice one. But the thing about it is, this is just a storehouse. Except God's people come into it and worship God as we should, and they come to that point of where they give God honor and praise. It's just a building. You would be surprised of the ones that had one foot out the door that are maybe out the door now. But that's all they could see. It was just a building. Maybe they were brought up in church to go to church, but they never really, in their heart, had ever made a commitment to Jesus Christ. That makes a difference. Some people just see it as a building. Others, when you talk about church, it's like a club. It's like some club to where we all come together, we get together, and we have a good time. And we enjoy one another's company. And some people have come to that point. You know, would you agree that we live in a virtual country? That probably isn't the right way to state that. But the way we do things is virtual. Let me give you an example. You could find me running it down the aisles at Walmart buying groceries. I don't do that anymore. I call mine in. Well, I punch them in. And then when I get up there, I call this number and I'm saying I'm in a certain lot and my car is white. A few minutes, they bring out the groceries, put them in my car. Is there anything else? Nope, that's it. I put the old car in drive, and I go home and I put up the groceries. That's virtual. No longer am in contact with what I do. School has got to the point in many places to where learning is virtual. Is there anything that's lost by a child learning virtually? And if we answer that no, then we're getting close to what virtual doing things in the church and the casualties it can cause. Oh, Gary, you're so ugly this morning. Bear with me and I'll try to make it short. I honestly believe, church, and virtual is good. I thank God that we've had that. Don't you remember, Scott, wasn't it for a while we was trying to come up with a way to come out on the front porch and preach and people could listen from their cars. It didn't work out real good, but we thought about doing it that way for a while. And then, like I said, that one time I come in here, I can see the humor in Jennifer because she had took these big old pictures of people, us, and she'd tape them to the pews in here where when Seth and I preached, we didn't have to preach to the pews, we preached to people, pictures of people. But it was virtual. When things are done virtual, and it's good to a certain point, thank God we got through it that way. But you know what? A lot of people this morning that could be here saying, well, I'll just listen in on my TV. Now, if you're listening in on your TV this morning, I'm glad you're listening. But you know what? I would much rather have you back in person. Do I need to be in person to really be right with God? Let's see about that. We do so many things virtual. Why not church? Why not just have church virtual? And we don't even have to come in here and shake hands with one another. We don't have to rub shoulders with one another. We'll just listen at home and we'll still be counted as part of Buckner Baptist Church. I beg your pardon. That is not the way God set it up. God did not intend for His church to be a virtual church. Never. And so when we're looking at that this morning, I hope that I've proved to you, first of all, I'm trying to, is that church, and for those that have dropped out, you may say, well, I hear him. I hear every word that he's preaching just like you do in person. But we leave out the fellowship. Well, I'm a loner anyway. I don't really care to be too close to people. You may feel that way. But that's not the way God set it up. That's not the way that He set it up. Let me give you, I better get in some scripture. I'm going to really ramble this morning. In the book of Hebrews, I want you to listen to this. I picked out these verses because I think they fit. I think Paul was the writer of Hebrews myself. But in the 10th chapter, starting in verse 19, I'll read this, and I want to focus in particular on one verse. Paul is telling these Christians, he says, having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, in other words, being right with God, by a new and living way, he's talking about through Jesus Christ, which He has consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, His flesh or His body, what Jesus done on the cross. And having a high priest over the house of God, that is again, that's Jesus. He says this, let us. Now, you know, virtual would probably mean in the singular. We're gathering together like this, we're in the plural. All of us together. But he says this, let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled, or we might say cleansed, from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Verses 23, 24, and 25 is really where I'm going. Listen to this. Let us, did you catch it? Plural again. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. Well, I'm going to get ugly. When you see no need to come to church, I believe you're wavering. All right, maybe I better back up a little here. There's some people that would like to be in church this morning, but because of health issues, they cannot. That's different. If your health is that where you could go to church and you have just chosen to say, no, I'm going to stay at home, I'll listen to them on Facebook. That's much different. But there's some people, health issues, sickness, they can't come to church. But the point is this. If we have an opportunity to come to God's house with God's people, we should take very much advantage of that. He says, let us hold fast, verse 23, the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that promised, and let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. I want to ask you a question. How good can you, when it says provoke here, let me see if I can come up with a word there. Stir up or stimulate. He says, let us provoke unto love and good works. How can we stir one another up if we're sitting at home watching the message on our phones or on your laptop? It takes being in person to stir up one another. All right, does anybody want to hold up your hand this morning and say, I never need stirring up? I never need anybody to tell me that I need to be encouraged on the things of God? I don't, certainly. Let me tell you what, those of you that's not quite sure of your work in the Lord, that are encouragers, I think you're some of the most important people in this church. And I rely upon you a lot. Because when I come in and I'm down and out and Satan's got me backed up against the wall during the week, beating me up, there's nothing that does my heart any better than coming to God's house and being provoked by you to love and encouragement. Oh, how I need that in my life. That can't be done virtually. You say, well, I can pick up the phone. How many of you do? All right, here's the point. He was saying then that we need, after we've been saved by the grace of God and all of His goodness, He says, let us hold fast our profession of faith. And He says, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works. Last verse, notice what He says in verse 25. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is. Even back then there were people that didn't see the need for coming together as the church. They did not see that. And he says, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. There's one of the ingredients, people, of why we need to be in person in church. Is to where we can be encouraged by one another. Now, you could ask Carolyn. I'm sure she's got some good war stories on me. Boy, sometimes I can be hard to live with. Anybody else like that here this morning? You're not going to say nothing, are you? Sometimes I can come into God's house and I've allowed old Satan to talk to me, and I've listened to him way, way too much. And you know what? When I come in contact with you, God's people in this church family, let's look at it that way, and you begin to encourage me. Look at this. I have never seen everybody down at the same time. Thank God for that. Thank God that there's times in our lives where I may be down and you're up and you encourage me, but there's just probably a short amount of time where it'll be right opposite. You may be down and I'm up. We need to encourage one another in God's house. And when we drop out of church, you can't be encouraged. Well, listen, virtually. Not much. We need personal contact, all right? Go a little further. Bill, you might want to put the clock up on me there where I don't run out of time this morning. I've got a lot to say. If I don't get it said this morning, I'll say it tonight, okay? All right, but anyway, a third of the people, churchgoers, during this COVID have dropped out. That, in my opinion, is a casualty. It's a casualty that hurts us. Now, we need everybody in this church. I don't care if you feel like you're nothing more than a finger or a thumb. We need you in this church. The church talks about, or the Bible does, in 1 Corinthians 12, where we're all like part of a body. And whether one part seems insignificant or not, it's needed just as much as anything else. And so there it is. We need the church. We need to be in it in person, not virtual. Do I really have to go to church? Is it really important that I should go? All right, look at this. Answer this in yourself. Is going to church just a duty that I do on Sundays? Is that all that it is? Is church more than a duty? How much priority does God's will have in my life? Boy, there's a good question. How much priority? Now, when you see churches that's not having Sunday night services, they're not having Wednesday night services, just a fraction of what there was. There's something going on. I'd say it's not for the better. All right, let's look at this. You talk about that old church. Why should I be a part of it? Okay, Bill, I'm going to skip over here. I want us to look at this morning. Yeah, I better go over there. I want us to look this morning into book of Matthew, chapter 16. Don't you notice what the Lord says here? By the way, you think David was a godly man? Look at Psalms 122, verse 1 for just a minute, and notice what David had to say there. He said, I was glad when they said, come, let us go to the house of the Lord. What made him glad to be able to get to go to God's house? Others saying, I can't find my shoes. I can't find my good shirt. I can't find my good shoes. I'm not going to church this morning. I believe that David had to. Now, this read between the lines, Becky. I believe if he had to go barefooted, he'd have probably went. He said, I was glad when they said, come, let us go to the house of the Lord. Here's a question. Are you glad to be here this morning? Are you glad to be in God's house? If you're in the right frame of mind and if you're looking at church in the right way, you'll be glad that you're here this morning. Oh, my head's hurting. I wish I'd have stayed at home. Did you know some of the best blessings I have ever had, especially on Wednesday nights? It's when I thought, oh, I feel so bad. I don't know what I want to go tonight or not. Some of the best classes I've ever been in is when I went in feeling bad, come out feeling a lot better. A lot better. But in this particular case here, let's look at Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, I think it is. Let me make sure that's where I want to go. Yeah, it is. These were the words of Jesus. And he was speaking in particular. Verse 16, I'm going to start there, Phil. I'll mess you up big time. And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ. He was talking to Jesus, the Son of the living God. Jesus commends him here in the next verse, and he says, And Jesus answered and said unto him, or to Peter, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonas, that's Peter, for flesh and blood is not revealed it, or this thought unto you, but my Father which is in heaven. He says, God is the one that's caused you to realize this. And then he says this, and here we go right here. Why is church important? Why is it something that I need to be a part of? Look at verse 18. Words of Jesus. That makes it that much more important. And he says this. I say also unto thee, Peter, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock. Now that rock means a foundation, something solid that you can build your life upon. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Did you notice what Jesus says about the church? Upon this rock I'll build my church, he says. Peter, not your church. This is not Buckner's church. This is God's church here this morning. And he says that. He says it to us 2,000 years later, that upon this foundation, this solid thing in life, I'm going to build my church. And he says, and when I build it, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. You may look at your evening news and say, man, sin has got too much of a foothold. How could God ever get on top of that? I'll guarantee you, God can stop this at any moment if He so desires. He's the one that's got the supreme power. One reason that we come to church is this. We come to church because Jesus said, "This is my church." And when you put your faith and your trust in what God has provided through Jesus Christ, and you're saved by the grace of God, it should be automatic. You want to be part of His church. Now that's a fact, people, as far as I'm concerned. There ain't no theory to that at all. It's because Jesus set it up, and He set it up. And here's another thing. Did you notice the way that Jesus or God has set up His church? He set it up not like an organization, not like a club, but like a family. That's why we call one another Brother Gary, Sister so-and-so, Brother so-and-so. That simply means we look at one another as being part of this family of God. You say, well, I can be part of this universal church, and I don't need to go here. It's not the way He set it up. He set it up where you and I can be together. Now, I could go much further into this. I've said about all I think I need to say this morning. You know what? There is an old saying, the mind can't comprehend any more than what the bottom can set. You ever heard that before? When you get tired physically, you're no longer listening. I want to put out just enough to where you're still listening and that God can use for it to touch your heart. That's what my goal is this morning. We need one another. We need to be rubbing shoulders. We don't need to have, I could sit at home this morning in my pajamas, my feet propped up, watching you on either a cell phone or on a tabletop. But you miss being with God's family, which you're supposed to be a part of. If you've been saved by the grace of God, that automatically makes you part of the family. Problem is, did you remember what He said over there a while ago in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25? Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some people is. Now, I added a word or two, but that's what it's getting at. We need one another. We're all part of this family of God. Every one of us. Every one of us needs one another. Have you ever thought about the apostles? I'm going to say this real quick, like, the 12th. Jesus chose them personally Himself. They were handpicked. Now, I realize that they followed Jesus around and seen the many miracles and everything He did, but, they stayed together all the time. Can you imagine how complicated it could have got? When they were all sitting around a campfire at night, and somebody like Matthew that was picked by the Lord, that had been a tax collector, and how he was hated by some of the others that were Herodian. Can you imagine? Could have got real silent around the campfire because there wasn't nothing left to talk about. But you know what? There was one thing they all had in common. Whether they were fishermen, whether they were tax collectors, whether they were Herodians or whatever, they all believed that Jesus Christ was God's answer for sin and what they needed in their lives. Is that not what we are here today, people? That's exactly what we are. We're part of the family of God. Mark, if you'll come up here, we're hurting in some areas as far as music this morning. Mark is going to play for us on the organ. I want you to know that there's been a lot of casualties, and it's hurt this church because we haven't been able to get together because of this COVID, but it does not have to go on that way. You may be that you're crossways with somebody else in this church. Coming back to church and being part of this church and rubbing shoulders with one another, that's why that some of the apostles that were so different in their backgrounds could work together, is because they loved Jesus Christ, and they were bound and determined to carry out what was right in Jesus' eyes in their life. This morning, As we're getting ready for a verse of invitation, we'll give Mark time. Are you ready, Mark? All right, that's good. This morning, I want to ask you a question before we have a verse of invitation. Is God speaking to your heart? Maybe you're not a casualty, but you know what? You could be one of those 1/3 of the people that were regular churchgoers that could still drop out. If you do not listen to a living God speaking in your heart, you need us. We need you. Thank you, Darrell. I was getting there. We all need one another. Did you know that the world, you think, well, the world, surely, during this pandemic, do you think the evening news was really concerned about the little churches like ours, how well they were doing, how well they're not? I don't care. You know who cares about Christians, Christianity, God's church that He has built? It's God's people. People just like you and me. If God is speaking to your heart this morning, people, and there's some things that have caused you to be distant or out of touch with God, out of touch with God's family, as we stand this morning, would you stand with me, please? If God is speaking to your heart this morning as we have a verse of invitation, Mark, I want to ask you this morning, would you as much as just simply bring that up here to God? Oh, how we need one another. I'm going to tell you something. You know who the big winner is if you drop out of church? Or if those on the screen that may be listening this morning that have determined I don't need to go to church, do you know who's the big winner this morning? It's not God, but it's Satan. He's the one that has gained through all this because he's kept you from the things of God. So as Mark is playing, if there's a need in your life, I encourage you right now, bring it up here to God. Lay it at His feet. We all have need. We all have need of encouragement. Times we all have need of just simply laying it all out before God. If that's you this morning, would you come?